What's up, everybody? Well, we have had Easter. Happy Easter. Late. Um, I got a bracelet that says happy, but it doesn't say Easter. Well, I said in another video that I might make a video. Let's see, I'll try to put that light more on me. Might make a video about these shoes. Remember the red shoes? I call them Gerbert shoes because the character wore them, but they're just Converse. I just wish that they would have made a lot more of those. I wish they would have, I wish there was a doll shoe store where you could literally choose from a drop-down menu of shoes. And, this would be a very popular style of shoe. They'd make it in the Ken size. They'd make it in the Barbie size. They'd make it in, in between sizes of kidcore dolls. And you could get red, black, or blue, among others. Well, I bought those shoes, and for now, they're on this doll, Hot Stuff Skipper. And what I wanted to make a video about, well, it's still close enough to Easter, and by the way, we got a cold front, making Easter a little bit cooler than Christmas. Had a wonderful, lovely Easter, but I wanted to talk about my Scott doll. Scott was a brief boyfriend of Skipper around 1978 or 9, may have been sold around 1980. So when I was about, I guess, -4, 1979-ish, there was this boyfriend named Scott. And unfortunately, he was like a one-time appearance. Some male dolls only appeared one time and were never made again. And this is Hot Stuff Skipper. And what's special about her is she represents a brief transitory period of Skipper's life in the late 70s and early 80s, wherein she was made interchangeably with various bodies, okay? So in the 60s, was my favorite Skipper when she had the flat-chested 9.5-inch body of a child that hasn't hit puberty, and it was used on Ricky, okay? And I should have brought those. Well, this one was another body mold where she was slightly taller, like 9 3/4, so about 4'11", translated to human height. And what was interesting is you almost always, it was almost always all girls during that time, but Scott was the only exception. And I want to talk about him. How, she came in the day before Easter, about as late as she could come in, and still get in by Easter. I think it was Holy Saturday or something, Easter Eve. And what's special about her is, I think it was like they really couldn't decide what to do with Skipper, what they should have done was just continue her as a pre-adolescent child. But she was kind of in limbo. There was the controversial growing up Skipper and Ginger, which is probably how, as told by Ginger, got her name. The kind of red-haired version of her. But, so they were transitioning from Skipper as a little child that hadn't hit puberty and her body could be used on a boy. And that was like the 60s. Well, in the 70s, they started experimenting with teen Skippers, wherein she was almost 10 inches, had small breasts. See, she was naked. I put her in this cute little dress. She had small breasts, but she looked slightly older. And the male counterpart was really interesting. He looks like a short man. He's like a Kevin doll, only slightly shorter. And he looks, I've barely trimmed his hair in the back. I'd much rather him, have a shorter haircut, but that just wasn't the style. Men were kind of, supposedly, some men were toying with the idea of being as effeminate as they could be without officially being seen as gay. And I really hate that. I really wish the doll industry didn't always portray the one token male as effeminate or, because he's with the girls, he's just like a girl. Well, no, we need some male representation. We need to see masculinity, even if that's not the end thing at the time. So there's the Scott doll. And what's interesting about Scott is like with so many male dolls, they thought they had to put all kinds of gimmicks, to make children or make anyone want to buy them. Because unfortunately, they just didn't sell. They never have. But in those days, they hadn't quite figured out just how unwilling people were to buy a male doll. And so they made Scott. And I used to have a Scott. He's sort of like my very first purchase ever on eBay was Kevin, boyfriend of Skipper. And I wanted him because he was a short Ken doll. He was supposed to be an adolescent boy. But the reality is he comes across looking like a very short man, about 5'1" or 5'2". He just looks like a guy who is of short stature, rather than an adolescent boy. Because unfortunately, when a guy is able to build muscle like that, and in those days the short shorts with the trim were the in thing, and he came with jeans, which I should have brought those in. I washed them by hand, but they were very tattered and they were like 70s style jeans, and I just decided to put him with his matching shorts and jacket and blue shoes, which are my favorite. But they thought, well, I mean, what they should have done was give him a head sculpt more like that little Timmy from Lassie doll. He should have had a head sculpt, sort of like the Donny Osmond doll that was clearly a young boy's face and had more clothing hiding his muscle. That would have made him a better doll instead of looking like a man, with longish 70s hair. He just looks like a man who is of short stature instead of an adolescent boy. Because the thing is, boys don't grow muscles like that early in puberty. And by the time a boy, starts having, a masculine look about him, by the time the voice changes, as I've talked about before, he's near the end of his growth spurt, which is what makes it so inappropriate, to have these little cartoon characters, little boys on cartoons like Donnie Thornberry and like Timmy on Odd Parents' friends and Jimmy Neutron's friends. That's what makes it so ridiculous for them to have men's voices. Because if you know anything about child development or, the way the body develops, you know that the voice change, somewhat like the menstrual period in girls, happens near the end of puberty. The completion, the masculinization of the voice, meaning when it's significantly lower than mine. Significantly cannot sound anything like a woman's voice anymore. By the time the voice gets to be like that, they're near the end of their growth spurt. And so if they have a man's voice when they're, barely 5 feet tall, or even, in the 4-foot range and below, guess what? They're not going to grow much taller. You could be 3 feet tall with a man's voice, but guess what? That means you do not have much growing left to do. You're going to be a little bitty short little guy. You're not going to be a big basketball player, 6 feet tall. If your voice masculinizes, when you're little bitty like that. So, Jimmy Neutron's friends, Timmy Turner's friends, Donnie Thornberry, these stupid one-time characters on Rugrats like Emmett and, a few, boys who luckily were not seen often, but, these characters that look like a little boy, but yet their voice is a man. Doug Funny, he's pretty close to an adult height, but, so when they have a man's voice, they really don't have much growing left to do. Just like when a girl has a period, she doesn't get that much taller after that. And so, Scott ends up looking like a 20-something or even 30-year-old man who is short. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being that. But he fails to pull off, the 13-year-old boy or, 14, 15-year-old boy look. And so, but when you put him next to a Ken doll, you see that he's, a bit shorter. So there's Scott. And what I wanted to talk about is something I regret. I always end up talking about regrets. Once upon a time, I did have a Scott who was like mint in box, had never been removed from box. And I think it was when I was still living with my mom. I don't know how, I got that in and she didn't really know about it. But I think it was like 2014 or something like that. So I was still 30. And so I had this Scott doll, and I think I paid maybe $29. I shouldn't have bought him, but I've just always wanted a Scott doll. But the problem is that because they made so many fewer of him than Kevin, he was so rare and went for hundreds of dollars. I mean, we're talking like a head of a Scott doll one time was listed at $75, just the head. And so if you found a body, I bought a body for a pretty hefty price, just the body alone. And so he went for a high price because there was only ever one Scott doll made. And, because he's a rare size and didn't stick around for very long, he goes for a high price. Well, somebody was just trying to get rid of this mint in box Scott. And, the box was old and kind of weathered, yellowed out. And it had pictures of Scott, drawings of him, what he would look like as a person in a cartoon. And you would think that had been listed at $200 easily. Skates were still in the box in a plastic bag. His shorts, he was wearing his blue jeans, which I need to show the ones that came with him. Need to repair them. But he was in the box, and I bought him, and I should have kept him. I really should have kept him. But I just, for whatever reason, I was trying to organize my stuff, and I decided, I'm sick to death of having this doll that I don't feel comfortable removing from the box. I should have just taken him out the box and still kept the box. But then he still, I would have felt like I had decreased his value. I always envisioned myself getting $100 easily for that. But for whatever reason, I sold him. I thought a couple years ago, and I probably lost money rather than made money off of it. But I sold it because I just couldn't stand to have this doll that I didn't feel comfortable removing from a box because the box was a huge chunk of his value. But what ended up happening, so I went a few years without having a Scott doll. I just had two Kevins, darker and lighter hair. One of them looks bleach blonde, the other looks light brown. And so I had two Kevin dolls, and I figured that's all the Kevins that I need, because one of the reasons I got rid of the Scott, the 70s Scott that I used to have, was because I did not have the matching skipper. And what was stupid about Scott, okay, and I should have kept the mint one, but he had roller skates. He was one of the few male dolls to have roller skates. And they look like just a yellow version of these tennis shoes with a black axle and yellow wheels attached. And they had purple stripes. See, he's like purple and gold, like LSU, and blue. So, I should have kept that one because, I'll never know the thrill of putting his skates on and skating him across a table like he could have been in the 70s. But one of the reasons why I got rid of Scott, because I felt like even though I'd only spent maybe $29 on him, which is cheap, that's listed very low. That's somebody wanting to get rid of him badly. He could have easily gone for $100, as rare as he is. But I didn't want to keep him partly because I didn't have the matching skipper, I had a lot of skipper dolls from around that time, but I did not have the 1979 skipper that was supposed to match. What was stupid was that she was a matching skipper, but also mismatched in the way that he had roller skates. But guess what? She did not have roller skates, and instead she had a skateboard, like a scooter or, some sort of a skateboard and a helmet, which is stupid because it's usually the other way around. Like if one person's going to wear old-fashioned roller skates with four wheels, like a car, the person who would get on a scooter or a skateboard would usually be male. It's usually the girls that would want the old-fashioned roller skates, and the boys would have wanted the skateboards, but I hate that. I hate the subversion of both dolls and cartoons, always trying to take what is usually the case, what boys usually do and what girls usually do, and switch them around. I detest that with every fiber of my being. Having dads cook, having moms cut the grass in freaking high heels in a children's book. I wanted to burn that effing book. was called If You're Happy and You Know It. When I was 8 years old, of all things, I already recognized how stupid that was. That the little girl Hillary was turning 4 years old, but what was weird, was she went outside and her mom was cutting grass wearing freaking high heels and a dress, and her dad was inside making burgers or something, hot dogs. I guess that was symbolic. In the kitchen, wearing men's dress clothes and dress shoes. And it's ridiculous because it should have been the other way around. Dad should have been outside in blue jeans and a plaid flannel cutting the grass, and mom should have been in the kitchen wearing an apron cooking. And I already recognized that at freaking 8 years old. This book about how a 4-year-old can still cheer up her stuffed animals even if she can't do grown-up things like mommy and daddy. Well, what mommy and daddy were doing was the problem, you see. So I really hate that subversive way that they have with children's media, children's, dolls, cartoons. They always want to take things that, boys in real life would never want anything to do with, like pink, peach, and purple, putting purple stripes on the frickin' skates, yellow frickin' skates instead of blue or black, and making boys do things that are borderline effeminate and girls do things that are masculine, like skateboards that just happen to be pink to say it's for a girl. So yeah, I hated that, but also I did not keep Scott partly because I did not have the Skipper. It was meant to go with him, and I never will, because she's also a rare find. They didn't make that specific version of Skipper for very long. So they were toying with the idea of should Skipper be a teenager or a younger child. So they kind of made them interchangeably, like they switched between body molds. In 1979, she had little breast. I think around 1983, like around the year I was born, they rolled out another version of Skipper that was like going back in time. Like she didn't have breasts, but she had a tan. She was like a tan version of the 60s Skipper with a smile. And I have one like her. And so she didn't have breasts. I have to show those. And she was like, she had that ridiculously dark tan skin that was popular in the early 80s, around the time I was born. And so I didn't have one like that until many years later. And then in the mid-80s, they went to that face on a body like this, 9 3/4 with little breast, kind of like the 70s Skipper. So then they made her into a teen again. And then from there, in the late 80s, as they introduced Kevin, around 1989, around the time of Home Alone, which might be why they named him that, they introduced a whole new Skipper that looked slightly older than this. She was over 10 inches tall and had the Little Mermaid looking eyes, the big fish eyes that I've shown before, the Skipper and Courtney. So, they were like, the 80s were kind of a transitory period, the 70s and 80s, where they couldn't decide what to do with Skipper and who should be her boyfriend. And for a brief period of time, they tried to sell this doll, but the problem, that's a problem with long hair on men. As I've stated before, I detest long hair on men or anything, to do with that. I cannot stand it. Wish every man in the world had hair this short or shorter. Like, you cannot have hair longer than this as a man, or a young boy. I wish that, all men would just agree, that they just cannot have long hair. Yeah, this is cute and it kind of works when you're little, but I much prefer that men have shorter hairstyles, because it's like, how do you really can't sell a male doll. Male dolls are hard enough to sell as it is, but when long hair is popular for men and boys, it's like, how do you even say that something is a male doll? And that's why, he had to be in puberty or, look very adult-like in order to be seen as male. Because a Ricky doll, a little kid body Ricky doll with this hairstyle would be seen as a girl. And, and it's just infuriating. I've actually seen like Sunshine Family dad dolls, with that hairstyle listed as a girl fashion doll, even though it's plainly obvious that he's dad and not mom. He has a flat chest and he has bigger arms than the mom, and he's clearly supposed to be a male doll. But guess what people think he is with that hairstyle and not having a ridiculous amount of muscle? They think he's a female. And that's what happens. Men and boys, I can see advantages to women having shorter hair. You know, I know the advantages. But no advantage to longer hair on guys. None. None whatsoever. So, yep, rather he had shorter hair. So go ahead and post this video and say I'm glad they came in.